high above the frozen mountains of Korea. The sky became a chessboard. At 30,000 feet, decisions were made in seconds. One turn too wide, one climb too slow, and the advantage vanished. The Korean War was not only fought on ridges and in trenches, it was fought in thin air, where speed, instinct, and discipline separated survival from defeat. Among the many skilled aviators who took to those dangerous skies, Canadian pilots quietly built a reputation for calculated precision. They didn't rely on reckless aggression. They relied on timing, positioning, and the art of thinking one move ahead. Before we climb higher into this story, if you appreciate cinematic immersive history, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. Your support keeps these powerful stories flying. Now, let's enter the skies over Korea. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, air power quickly became one of its defining elements. Control of the skies meant protection for ground troops, secure supply routes, and the ability to observe enemy movement across mountainous terrain. The air war was fast, technical, and unforgiving. Jet aircraft roared into combat, marking one of the first large-scale jet versus jet conflicts in history. Pilots had to adapt quickly to new speeds, new altitudes, and new tactical realities. Among United Nations forces, Canadian aviators played an important role. While Canada did not deploy independent fighter squadrons in the same scale as some larger allies, Canadian pilots served with distinction in Allied air units, bringing experience shaped by the Second World War and rigorous post-war training. Many of these pilots had already learned hard lessons over Europe years earlier. They understood formation discipline. They understood energy management in air combat. And perhaps most importantly, they understood patience. The skies over Korea were dominated by fast jet fighters, including aircraft like the F-86, Sabre operated by United Nations forces, and the MiG-15, flown by opposing pilots. These aircraft were closely matched in performance, making pilot skill a decisive factor. Dogfights were no longer slow, turning engagements like those of early World War II. They were high-speed vertical duels. Pilots climbed aggressively, dove steeply, and relied on maintaining energy advantage. Altitude and speed, rather than simply turning tighter than the opponent. This is where Canadian training philosophy stood out. Instead of rushing into head-on engagements, many Canadian pilots emphasized controlled entry into combat zones. They approached contested airspace at advantageous altitude whenever possible. Altitude meant options. Options meant survival. Rather than chasing every visible aircraft, disciplined pilots selected moments carefully. If an enemy formation attempted to lure them into lower altitude, where speed advantage might shift, they resisted impulsive pursuit. In jet combat, losing altitude unnecessarily could mean losing initiative. Reports from the period describe engagements where calculated positioning allowed Allied pilots, including Canadians, to force opponents into defensive maneuvers without excessive risk. It was not about dramatic heroics. It was about geometry, angles, climb rates, sun position. Even the glare of sunlight could be used strategically, approaching from directions that reduced visibility for the opposing pilot. Communication in the air required clarity. Radio chatter had to remain precise. Wingmen protected leaders, and leaders trusted wingmen to monitor blind spots. Canadian aviators were known for tight formation, discipline, rarely breaking cohesion unless tactically necessary. This reduced vulnerability. In air combat, isolation can be dangerous. Another important element was emotional control. The adrenaline of high-speed engagement can push pilots toward aggressive pursuit, but aggression without structure can create exposure. Canadian pilots often demonstrated restraint. If fuel levels dropped to unsafe margins, they disengaged rather than extending combat unnecessarily. If weather conditions deteriorated over mountainous terrain, they adjusted altitude and regrouped. This approach did not eliminate danger, but it reduced avoidable risk. The Korean Air War also introduced a psychological dimension. Opposing aces, highly experienced fighter pilots, sought to dominate contested zones with reputation and confidence. Yet reputation alone does not win engagements. Preparation does. As sorties increased, Allied air units refined their tactics. Patterns were studied. Climb behaviors were analyzed. Entry routes into contested MiG alley. Airspace were adjusted to minimize predictability. Canadian pilots, integrated within Allied formations, contributed to this evolving tactical understanding. Their strength was not reckless dominance. It was adaptive thinking one move ahead, and soon, specific engagements would test whether discipline and positioning could truly outmatch experience and aggression in the high-altitude duels over Korea. The skies over northwestern Korea were unlike any battlefield most pilots had known before. Near the Yalu River, a stretch of airspace earned a reputation for intensity. Allied pilots informally called it MiG Alley. It was here that jet fighters met at extreme altitudes, often above 30,000 feet, where the sky darkened and the earth below seemed distant and unreal. Speed ruled everything. A split-second delay in reaction could mean losing visual contact. Losing visual contact could mean losing advantage. And losing advantage at jet speed could mean the fight was already decided. Canadian pilots operating within Allied squadrons entered this environment with a clear understanding. Survival depended on energy management. Energy in aerial combat is a combination of altitude and speed. The higher and faster an aircraft flies, the more options it has to dive, to climb, to disengage, or to attack. Many less experienced pilots, overwhelmed by the intensity of first contact, instinctively turn sharply to pursue an opponent. But tight turns at high speed bleed energy quickly. Lose too much speed, and the aircraft becomes vulnerable. Canadian aviators were trained to think vertically. Instead of horizontal turning duels, they often favored climbing, maneuvers after an attack pass, converting speed into altitude. From above, they could reassess the situation, reposition, and strike again under more favorable conditions. It was methodical. It was controlled. It was calculated. One common tactic involved entering contested airspace in coordinated formations with altitude advantage. Rather than diving immediately toward the first opposing jet spotted, leaders would assess the broader picture. Were there additional aircraft higher up? Was the initial contact a lure designed to draw them lower? Was the sun behind them giving concealment or blinding them? Canadian pilots were known for disciplined radio communication during these moments. Short, clear, calm. Excited chatter wastes time. Calm language preserves focus. If an opposing fighter attempted to bait a pursuit toward lower altitude, Canadian pilots often resisted unless the tactical picture was clear. Instead, they forced opponents to react to them. When diving from altitude for a firing pass, they aimed to strike quickly, then climb away before becoming entangled in prolonged turning engagements. It was not about chasing. It was about positioning. In several recorded engagements involving Allied units, calculated high-side attacks forced opposing jets into defensive spirals. Even highly skilled adversaries could be pressured into evasive maneuvers when attacked from above with speed advantage. The goal was not reckless destruction. It was forcing the opponent into a defensive posture. Once defensive, a pilot is reacting, not controlling. And control in aerial combat is everything. Weather added another layer of complexity. High-altitude winds were unpredictable. Jet engines performed differently depending on temperature and air density. Canadian aviators adapted carefully. They studied performance limits. They understood climb ceilings. They monitored fuel consumption constantly. Fuel was a silent timer in every engagement. Overextend too far north, and returning safely could become difficult. This awareness shaped tactical restraint. There were moments when opportunities for extended pursuit appeared tempting. But disciplined pilots measured risk against reward. Returning with aircraft intact and intelligence gathered often mattered more than a single aggressive chase. Another strength was teamwork. The wingman system was sacred. while the lead pilot focused forward during an attack run. The wingmen scanned constantly for threats from above or behind. Canadian pilots maintained tight spacing without crowding, ensuring visibility while minimizing vulnerability. If a wingman called out danger, leaders reacted immediately. Trust was not optional. It was survival. Opposing aces were formidable. Many had extensive training and confidence. They relied on surprise climbs, high-speed passes, and sudden reversals to disrupt formations. But surprise loses power when discipline holds. Canadian pilots, operating within Allied squadrons, contributed to refined countermeasures. Instead of scattering when surprised, formations tightened, climbed, and regained altitude advantage whenever possible. The sky became a three-dimensional chess match. Climb, dive, roll, reposition, not chaos, calculation. Gradually, these measured tactics yielded results. Engagements that might have devolved into frantic turning fights instead became structured encounters where altitude advantage and teamwork dictated momentum. It was never about proving superiority through bravado. It was about minimizing exposure while maximizing opportunity. The reputation that formed was subtle but real. Calm under pressure, disciplined in pursuit, difficult to lure into disadvantage. And yet, the ultimate test was still ahead. A high-altitude confrontation would soon unfold. One where seconds, sunlight, and split-second judgment would determine who controlled the sky. Morning light broke across the Korean peninsula with a pale, icy glow. At high altitude, the world felt silent, almost peaceful. But silence in contested airspace is often an illusion. On that particular sortie, Allied radar reports indicated increased jet activity near the Yalu River corridor. Multiple fast-moving contacts, higher than usual altitude, organized formation. This would not be a routine patrol. Canadian pilots, integrated within Allied squadrons flying the F-86 Sabre, climbed steadily toward operational altitude. The Sabre was respected for its balance of speed, maneuverability, and high-altitude performance. But like every aircraft, it demanded disciplined handling. Above 35,000 feet, oxygen masks pressed tight. Movements became deliberate. Every control input mattered. Then the call came through the radio. Contacts high, 11 o'clock. Small silhouettes appeared against the thin horizon, climbing aggressively. The opposing formation, flying the MiG-15, held altitude advantage. In aerial combat, altitude is leverage. Leverage means options. The moment was critical. An impulsive climb to meet them head-on could drain speed and leave the formation exposed. A dive could surrender altitude permanently. Instead, the Allied formation adjusted subtly. Rather than climbing directly beneath the opposing jets, they angled slightly off-axis, preserving energy while forcing the higher formation to decide first. It was a psychological exchange. Who would commit? Seconds stretched. The MiGs began a descending arc, attempting to convert altitude into speed for a firing pass. Vapor trails streaked briefly behind wings as gravity accelerated them downward. Now the choice had to be made. Canadian pilots executed a coordinated defensive split. Not chaotic, but pre-briefed. Some aircraft broke slightly left, others right, maintaining visual contact while disrupting the attacker's firing solution. The descending jets flashed past, too fast for a clean shot. In that instant, the altitude advantage shifted, because diving commits you, and commitment narrows options. The Sabres climbed sharply after the pass, converting speed into regained altitude. The sky turned into a vertical spiral, aircraft weaving, climbing, diving in controlled arcs. One Canadian pilot, maintaining disciplined spacing with his wingman, resisted the urge to follow a single MiG into a tightening horizontal turn. Instead, he stayed high, watching, waiting. The turning MiG lost speed gradually, trying to force a close engagement. But tight turns at altitude bleed energy quickly. Patience became power. From above, the Canadian pilot rolled inverted, dove with controlled acceleration, and aligned carefully for a firing window. Not rushing the shot, not spraying prematurely. A brief, calculated burst, then immediate climb. No prolonged chase. No unnecessary exposure. The opposing aircraft broke away sharply, descending to regain speed and distance. Across the broader sky, similar engagements unfolded. Not reckless dogfights, but structured exchanges of altitude and positioning. Wingmen remained disciplined. Check 6. Climbing. Braking right. Short, calm, efficient. At one point, a pair of MiGs attempted to isolate a Sabre by approaching from above and behind, a classic high-side attack. But the wingman system held. A timely warning call allowed the targeted pilot to break downward while his partner climbed to counter. The attackers were forced defensive instead. Momentum in air combat is fluid. It shifts rapidly. And on that morning, disciplined coordination repeatedly prevented isolation. Fuel gauges ticked downward steadily. The silent reminder that time in contested airspace is never unlimited. Canadian pilots measured engagement carefully. Once fuel margins approached predetermined safety thresholds, formation leaders called for regrouping. It takes restraint to disengage when the sky is still active, but restraint preserves aircraft and lives. As the Allied formation began controlled withdrawal southward, the opposing jets did not pursue aggressively. Altitude and distance rebalanced the encounter. The confrontation ended not in dramatic spectacle, but in strategic equilibrium. No formation shattered, no discipline broken. What stood out afterward was not a single moment of heroism. It was consistency. Refusal to be baited. Refusal to lose structure. Refusal to surrender altitude unnecessarily. Over time, these patterns built quiet respect. Opponents recognized that certain formations were difficult to surprise, difficult to isolate, difficult to overwhelm. And in aerial warfare, predictability can be exploited, but disciplined unpredictability cannot. The skies over Korea would continue to test every pilot who entered them. Yet each engagement reinforced a lesson. Speed alone does not decide outcomes. Aggression alone does not guarantee advantage. Control of altitude, of energy, of emotion shapes the sky. But one final chapter remains. Because beyond individual engagements lies legacy. How these calculated tactics influenced broader air operations. How reputation shaped future missions. And what lasting lessons emerged from those frozen skies. By the final year of the war, the air battles over Korea had settled into a tense rhythm. The dramatic surges of early conflict had given way to calculated patrols, structured intercepts, and disciplined withdrawals. Pilots on both sides understood the strengths and limits of their aircraft. Surprises became rarer. Preparation became everything. For Canadian aviators serving within Allied formations, the reputation they carried was not loud or boastful. It was steady. Mission planners increasingly valued pilots who could maintain formation integrity under pressure. Those who resisted reckless pursuit. Those who preserved aircraft strength over time, rather than chasing single dramatic encounters. Because air superiority in Korea was not won in one day. It was sustained over months. Every sortie followed a pattern of precision. Briefings were meticulous. Weather reports were analyzed carefully. Expected flight corridors were reviewed. But alternate routes were always prepared. Canadian pilots contributed to a culture of measured engagement. If radar suggested enemy aircraft climbing rapidly, formations adjusted altitude in advance rather than reacting late. If visibility was compromised by cloud layers, spacing tightened to prevent accidental separation. These details may seem small, but in high-speed jet combat, small details decide outcomes. Fuel discipline remained central. Many experienced aviators emphasized that the temptation to extend combat beyond safe margins was one of the greatest risks in the Korean Air War. The mountains below offered few safe emergency landing options. Returning intact was part of the mission. Another lasting contribution was the emphasis on adaptability. As intelligence evolved, so did entry tactics into contested zones. Instead of predictable straight-line approaches, formations varied altitude, speed, and direction to reduce the chance of ambush. The skies became less about brute speed and more about mental agility. Opposing aces remained formidable, highly trained and confident, They continued to test Allied formations with sharp climbs and high-speed passes. But over time, they encountered opponents who refused to be rushed. Canadian pilots understood that emotional control was as critical as technical skill. When confronted with sudden attack, panic wastes energy. Calm conserves it. When an opponent attempted to bait pursuit into lower altitude, discipline preserved advantage. When visibility blurred during tight maneuvers, trust in wingmen restored awareness. This collective steadiness influenced broader operational confidence. Commanders could assign patrol responsibilities knowing that structure would hold. Not every engagement ended decisively. In fact, many ended in mutual disengagement. But preventing loss while maintaining presence was itself strategic success. The Korean War air campaign demonstrated that jet combat required a new mindset. Vertical maneuvering, energy conservation, and teamwork replaced the romanticized image of lone duels. Canadian aviators, shaped by previous wartime experience and rigorous training, adapted effectively to this new era. An adaptation is survival. When the armistice was signed in July 1953, the guns on the ground gradually fell silent. In the air, routine patrols ceased. Aircraft returned to base not for immediate redeployment, but for transition. For many pilots, the silence felt unfamiliar. Months of high-altitude tension gave way to reflection. There were no grand parades in the sky, no dramatic final duel marking the end. Instead, there was quiet acknowledgement of endurance. The legacy left behind was subtle but meaningful. Calculated aggression, disciplined teamwork, respect for altitude and energy, emotional control under extreme pressure. These lessons extended beyond Korea. They influenced future training programs, shaping how jet combat would be taught in decades to come. Because the skies over Korea were among the first proving grounds of modern jet warfare, and those who navigated them successfully helped define its future. Today, historians examining the Korean Air War often focus on aircraft, performance statistics, climb rates, turn radius, top speed. But numbers alone do not tell the full story. Behind every maneuver was judgment. Behind every climb was calculation. Behind every disengagement was discipline. The story of Canadian pilots in Korea is not about rivalry for its own sake. It is about professional excellence within a broader Allied effort. It is about thinking ahead in a space where seconds matter. It is about outmaneuvering not through recklessness, but through restraint. High above frozen mountains, in thin air where engines strained and visibility blurred, the sky became a classroom for modern aerial strategy, and those who mastered it did so quietly. If you found this cinematic journey through history powerful, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments. Your support helps keep these untold stories alive. Until our next flight into history,